Thank you. Well, everyone, welcome once again to today's Nonprofit Net Zoominar, Meeting Human Resource Challenges. I'm Dennis Boyer, the president of the Nonprofit Net Board. We'd appreciate your feedback on today's Zoominar because it helps us plan future programs and it's important to our speakers. So we'll be sending you a survey link later on. Our Zoominars are open to everyone without charge. However, it costs several $1,000s to bring them to you, so we hope you'll consider supporting us. And since this is NPN's 20th anniversary year, we're suggesting a $20 donation. We need your support to keep the Zoominars coming your way, so we'll be sending you a link to our donation page also. And now, on to today's speaker, Margo Kelly, who served for many years as Chief Operating Officer at NeighborWorks America, and later as Executive Coach in the Achieving Excellence program at Harvard's Kennedy School. She's also the creator and leader of Nonprofit Net's recently inaugurated Leadership Acceleration Program. And Margo, we're glad you've had time to join us today with all of those credentials and activities. Welcome.
Thanks, Dennis.
And up to you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, let's get started. It's great to see so many people. I'm not sure I recognize many of you, but I hope to get to know you better. So I've really been looking forward to this. And then I got to see your questions. Actually, they're great questions, very practical. And this is going to be a very pragmatic session. That's the kind of manager I am and have always been. I think I had foolishly promised to send articles in advance of this session. But we received more than 40 questions and they really covered a pretty wide range of topics. So I made the executive decision that to send a bunch of articles to everyone wasn't really going to hit the mark for anyone. So here's what I'm offering instead. If in the course of the session, I don't get to an issue or a question or a challenge that you're facing, I'm happy to schedule a call with you individually, pro bono, no charge. But having done a lot of coaching and having worked as a senior manager for a long time, I am really keenly aware of the challenges that human relations issues can present, particularly to executive directors. So I want to make sure that if I don't get to your question today, which I'm sure I won't get to all of them, you have an opportunity to talk to me directly. I'll put my email, or maybe Dora will do it for me, in the chat box, and send me an email and we'll schedule a time. So before I get to your questions, I just want to cover 3 issues that constitute some of the most important lessons that I learned over 30 plus years in nonprofit management and in coaching executive directors. They relate in many ways directly or indirectly to some of your questions. And I include them because they were just such important learning opportunities for me. And I have to say, and this is probably true for many of you, most of the important management lessons I learned from my staff. First, some of the do's that I learned that have been really important to me. First is do everything you can to keep great staff. Do everything you can to help them grow in their roles or grow into new roles in your organization or elsewhere. Don't ever assume that good staff don't value the time and effort you spend with them. I made that mistake. I inherited at one point 7 division directors, most of whom were terrific, a couple of whom needed extra attention. I spent more of my time with the 2 that needed extra attention than with the other 5, until one of them informed me that he really wished that we could spend more time together. And my reaction was, Paul, I just don't know what it is you don't know. He said, I just want to brainstorm with you. I just want to spend more time with you. So just remember, good staff need your time and attention too. And everybody needs direct and honest and clear communication. Provide mentors, provide honest, timely, just-in-time feedback, and provide ways to develop skills for folks who need them, who perhaps have the will to do the job, but don't have all the skills that they need. You know, the best estimates are that it costs approximately 2 times the cost of salary to replace a staff, and that's a pretty impressive figure. So keeping good people is really a critical function of a good leader. And so here are some of the don'ts that I learned. Don't hire or promote based on potential. I've done it. It's often, and in my case, almost always been a mistake. You need clear evidence that a person can do something rather than making an assumption that they can do it. Don't do workarounds. If it becomes clear that you've offered all the meaningful help and support and training, even though you have, that someone isn't able or willing to do the job or fulfill the responsibilities of their position, don't try to rearrange the chairs on the deck in an attempt to find a new fit for them somewhere else in the organization, unless there's a hugely compelling reason to do that. And in some cases, that may in fact be the case. If someone isn't carrying their weight in your organization, you're not the only one who knows it. Everyone else knows it as well. And frankly, the implications for everyone else can be significant. And in many cases, really good staff are picking up the pieces and carrying more than their fair share of the load. You're the leader here, and your best staff are going to expect you to manage this situation effectively. And you know, people know when they're not meeting expectations. They're not happy either. Everyone wants to be defined in terms of their strengths instead of their weaknesses. When you've tried everything reasonable to improve performance, often the kindest thing you can do is sit down with a staff member and acknowledge that both of you are unhappy and suggest that they find a position that will emphasize their strengths. Everyone has strengths somewhere. Sometimes it's just not in the role they are currently in. Give them the opportunity to spend some time with you and brainstorm. Where are their strengths? Where might be some places for them to look elsewhere? My experience has been staff appreciate that. They acknowledge that they're not happy, and they really value the opportunity to think about what might work for them. And one of the things that people ask sometimes when a relationship is ending with their boss is, will you be a reference for me? And that's a key question. It's really important to them. They know that for other jobs, future jobs, people are going to want to talk to their previous supervisor. Sometimes if a person is leaving and their performance has been relatively poor, I can still acknowledge the strengths that they have. And so what I say to them when they ask me if I will be a reference for them is, Bruce, call me and tell me about a job you want to explore. Give me a little bit of description of the position, and I'll tell you whether I would be a good reference for you. That way they don't have to use me as a reference if I can't testify that I would be a good reference. And it gives them an honest feedback. And when checking references, I just mentioned this in passing because I'm sure some of you have been in the position of having to check references, and sort of the current mindset seems to be people will tell you sort of name, rank, and serial number. They'll tell you or confirm how long the person worked for them, but they're not willing to give you much more useful information. One of the things that I have done that has been particularly interesting is I read to a future employer the way the person described the job, or to a past employer, the way the person has described the job they did for them. They've included on their resume what they did in their previous job. Reading that to their former supervisor has some very interesting reactions. Sometimes they told the absolute truth, and the supervisor just confirms it and says, and they did a fabulous job. Sometimes the former supervisor takes offense at some of the descriptions that people provided about the many things that they did that they in fact really didn't have primary responsibility for. And that will elicit some interesting feedback from former supervisors. And the last unsolicited piece of advice I would offer here is consider 360 reviews. 360 reviews can be really, really revealing and create great insights among staff who perhaps are not working up to par, or who are not managing their staff as effectively as they could. And for really good staff, they can also provide some very important feedback. You don't want a laundry list of things for people to work on. I have found I've used many 360 instruments, many different approaches, and I found one that works extremely well, at least for me and for the people that I have supervised over time. And it only has 3 questions. The first question, what would you identify as Margo's 2 or 3 most significant strengths in her current position as you have observed them? And can you provide me with a couple of examples? And the second question, if Margo were to focus on 2 or 3 things that would have the most significant impact on her professional effectiveness in her current job, what might those things be? And can you give me a couple of examples? And the third question is simply, do you have any other comments that you could offer Margo that might be particularly helpful to her? This is a simple, manageable approach. It doesn't develop a long laundry list. People can't work on 12 things at once. 2 or 3 things in the area of places where people could grow or get better, 2 or 3 things will jump off the page and will be really significant and also be actionable. And it won't be discouraging as would be a list of 15 or 20 things. And the question about strengths is really important too. Many times people don't recognize the strengths that they display in their professional life. They don't see themselves as other people see them. And very often exploiting your strengths is as powerful as working on some intractable areas of weakness. So it's a really important question, not to be seen as just sort of a throwaway. So I offer those 3 suggestions because they have been powerful learning experiences for me. They've really helped me in my role as a manager, helped me work effectively with people, and help people figure out for themselves, how can I improve? And your best staff want to improve, as well as the staff who perhaps aren't doing as well as you would like. And you know, everybody, including all of you, I suspect, don't get enough useful feedback in your professional life. So it's a gift in many ways for a lot of people. So let me get to some of your questions. I've tried to group them a bit. I won't get to all of them, but remember my offer above. So this is one of my favorites and probably applies to many of you. Quote, how do you prevent burnout among a small staff when there is always more work and not enough time to do it all? You know, I've worked with executive directors in organizations with a staff of 1, and with executive directors, I think David Adami at Chicago's Boiler Casa probably has 700 staff by now. And I can guarantee you that this, no matter the size of the organization, almost every executive director could pose this question legitimately. I mean, the fact of the matter is, and you all know this, in mission-driven organizations, supply rarely exceeds demand. I mean, demand is consistent, it's multifaceted, and in many cases, it's overwhelming. So as a leader, you have a responsibility. You have a responsibility to help your staff understand and accept that fact. It's hard to do, and you need to do it on a periodic basis. Focus on what you are accomplishing, not on what you're not accomplishing. And you know, as a leader, what are you doing? I mean, are you setting an example? Do you exhibit a good work-life balance, or do you arrive at 7 a.m. and leave at 7 p.m. and then start sending emails at all hours of the day and night to your staff? Have you formally agreed with your staff on realistic, specific goals for them to achieve? Leaving, you know, some room for, you know, emergent situations that need to be dealt with, but having people be clear about the goals that they are expected and hope to achieve is really helpful in keeping people focused on what they can accomplish and not what they can't. And I don't know if any of you have developed a sort of a 2x2 matrix as you're setting your goals. You know, 4 quadrants, one axis being ease of delivery and the other axis being impact. Where are the low-hanging fruit that you can deliver without enormous overtaxing of your organization and where the impact could be disproportionately significant. And then what are the really hard things that you're trying to do that may not have as much impact as you thought or had hoped? Take a look and see where the low-hanging fruit is. People need to feel wins sometimes. They need to feel that they are achieving wins, that there's progress being made. And very often staff get buried in the weeds and they don't see the wins when you reach them. So as a leader, this is something you can do. Help call out the wins when you see them, even if they're small. It's motivational for people. It makes people focus more on what's being done as opposed to what's not being done. Let me just see. So you can ignore demand. You can even tamp it down by limiting your services, by making them more complex to access. But if you have a sound performance management system, if you have realistic goals, if you have an ongoing dedicated effort to enhance your resources, you have done what you can do about supply. The supply will always exceed the demand, and you will always feel that. And if you can help your staff feel it less acutely, that's a real gift that you're giving to them. So there are a couple of questions about organizations where your board is essentially serving in an HR function, that you don't have an HR staff or an HR director. How to orient them to their responsibilities, how to ensure that they execute this role fairly. First of all, if you don't have an HR professional on your board and you don't have an HR department, or even if you do, having an HR professional on your board can be incredibly valuable. And not just any HR professional. Getting referrals, getting suggestions, getting references. You want somebody who understands and values the mission of your organization, who has a balanced view of relationship building, the importance of relationships among staff, and policies, procedures, employment law, and that kind of stuff. So it's got to be the right HR person, but they can be really, really valuable to you and to the board as a whole. So when you're developing a list of recruitment needs for board members, I put that fairly high on the list if you don't have someone filling that role on your board now. Secondly, I really hope that whatever role the board plays, they understand the difference between governance and operations. I've seen significant slippage in terms of boards getting into operations when, in fact, their role is governance. Essentially, the board has responsibility in several key areas. Some people say 5, some people say 7 in terms of human relations. The hiring and evaluation of the executive director, workplace policies, specifically legally compliant personnel and employment policies and procedures. They have responsibility for compensation, for succession planning for the executive director and for themselves. And whistleblowing and layoffs are also something the board has a key role in should they occur. Standard documents in most of these areas are available online from resources like BoardSource, like Bridgespan, and others. I mean, typically and advisedly, the executive director is the only one who reports directly to the board. Where that is not the case, the challenges of distinguishing governance and operations becomes significantly more difficult. Hiring, evaluation, and if need be, firing of other staff are the responsibility of the executive director, not the board. Again, an experienced HR director on your board can be a critical asset. And if that's not a resource that you currently have, a good nonprofit consultant who has expertise in HR in one session can train your board on their HR responsibilities and on the difference between governance and leadership regarding HR matters. So that's something also to consider. There are several questions about compliance, especially when hiring employees in other states who will work virtually. And that is becoming more and more an issue for folks as, virtual work is becoming much more prominent. My guess is most of you have already explored PEOs, professional employment organizations. One of you noted that hiring a PEO at this time is not an option. ADP and Insperity have pretty much cornered the market in terms of PEO services, but they're costly. And I've been told particularly recently, I've been told that their service isn't always timely and it isn't always precisely what's been asked for or what is needed. Another option some folks I work with have used is to partner with an organization, another organization that works in a multi-state format that shares your organizational values. I think that part is important. And in this case, some people have contracted for specific services like vetting employment practices and laws in other states, specific other states. And obviously, other folks have gone further and wanted to take advantage of broader organizational back office functions or to hire another organization as a fiscal sponsor. Third Sector New England, or I think they're now Third Sector MissionWorks. I used to run their coaching practice, and they are a fiscal sponsor for a lot of nonprofit organizations. And finally, I'd offer that 650, that's capital SIX, capital FIFTY, if you haven't heard of it. A number of folks that I have worked with use them specifically to get the policies and practices, employment policies and practices of other states, specific other states. I didn't price it. I didn't have a chance to do that before this call, but I've been told that it depends on the size of your organization and how many states you will be active in. They have what is called a 50-state hiring kit. So it's worth being aware of. It may be useful at some point, if not now. There was a question about 401k enrollment for interns. I haven't seen this question before. I think, if you've worked with 401k, you probably are aware that you have to be 21 years old. You have to be full-time employed for the organization in question before you are eligible. That tends to eliminate most interns from eligibility. I don't know whether you have the option of enrolling interns if they've worked for you for a full year. I don't know. I would say, and some of you may be aware of this, that the IRS has become more interested lately in folks who are working full-time with an organization who call themselves consultants or interns, when the IRS, by their rules and regulations, would call them full-time staff. So I just simply suggest that before you consider offering 401k enrollment to someone who is an intern with your organization, that might be something you want to look into, or to ask a colleague in another organization if they have experience with that. Outsourcing HR functions. This is interesting. I'm sure some of you may do this. It's not cheap. It's not cheap. The ones that are most often outsourced, at least in my experience, and you all may have experiences beyond this, but job descriptions, excuse me, recruitment and development of a qualified, diverse candidate pool, compensation and benefit comparables, figuring out, for various positions, what do other organizations offer. For larger organizations, or depending on what kind of an organization you are, data and analytics, HR data and analytics, or HR IT functions. And sometimes some training and development functions are outsourced. The two functions that are rarely outsourced, in my mind, for good reason, are staff selection and performance management. And unless you have a specific contractual agreement with the PEO, decision-making on the other functions should rest within your organization. They may recommend, they may suggest, they may show you comparables, but the decisions on those matters should really rest with you. And one more observation I make about this: there's a difference in my mind between personnel functions and human relations. Compliance, payroll, IT are technical personnel functions. Performance management, including staff recognition, staff development, organizational culture, including diversity, equity, and inclusion. Conflict management, those are human relations functions. Getting advice from others and exploring how others handle these issues can be very, very helpful. In my view, farming out any of these responsibilities is risky. So the next question on this list right now is how to recruit a diverse applicant pool for open positions. This is a really critical question, and I think it is more prominent and essential right now than perhaps it has been in a long time. I'm sure it's no surprise to any of you that the best way to attract a diverse applicant pool is to have a diverse staff who can testify that your organization is a great place to work. Before I became director of field operations at NeighborWorks America, I was a New England district director. The staff I had inherited was largely white, which really was totally inappropriate given our constituency and the people that we hope to serve. And I knew enough to know that it had to change. So there was this man named Ken Wade, whose name was quite familiar to me. I did not know him personally, but he was quite prominent in the African-American community in Boston. He was the deputy director of a large settlement house. And I called him and I just asked if I could meet with him. And he didn't know me, but he graciously agreed. And we sat down and I explained to him what my diversity goals were and why. He had some great suggestions. I took every single one of them. And from then on, when I had an opening, I called Ken. And he recommended other people for me to talk to, both who might be interested in the position and who could also provide referrals. And I called every one of them and I interviewed every one of that any of them sent to me. Even if I didn't think they were appropriate for the opening I had, I wanted to get to know them a little bit. I wanted them to get to know me a little bit. I wanted them to understand the organization that we were running and why this issue was important. And from then on, I called Ken and all of them when I had an opening. And within 18 months, I had hired 3 people into vacant positions who were recommendations of some of these people. And those people became the sales force for the New England district staff in terms of this is a good place to work. And by the time I left as COO, more than half the people that that were managers in the organization that reported to me were people of color and diverse interests and complexions. And another note, when I became director of field operations at NeighborWorks, I called Ken and said, you know, anybody who might be interested in looking at the district director job that I had just left. And he said, you know, I actually might be interested in talking to you about that. So Ken became the New England district director. When I became COO, he became the director of field operations. And eventually he became the CEO of NeighborWorks America. So getting people in the door is the critical first step. And whatever you have to do that, do it. And then making sure that they are included, that they feel that they belong in the organization, and that they are charged with helping to further diversify your candidate pool. So the person who asked this question asked whether job descriptions were the problem, whether there are things that should be emphasized or de-emphasized in job descriptions. And frankly, I really doubt that job descriptions are the problem. I think at this point, most folks have a really good sense of how you develop a job description that is inclusive in terms of who you're inviting to express interest. But people pay far more attention to what you do than what you say or what you write. So, you know, developing a diverse and committed staff takes time. It takes time from the executive director. It takes a genuine, conscious, consistent effort to make cold calls to people who could be resources to you, to ask everyone on your staff and on your board what networks they have that you don't have. It's work, but it is so well worth it. And once you make a breakthrough, there's some self-fulfilling prophecy that begins to develop. And stay in touch with people who you develop as resources, even when you don't have openings. Stay in touch with people. You never know who might be interested in something. It's just well worth doing. And I guess the other thing I would just finally say, can you afford a stipend or an internship? Lots of universities have students who are looking for internships, either for academic reasons or for summer financial reasons. Contact university student employment offices, describe your diversity goals, ask for referrals, and then make sure you have a substantive role for the interns to play. There are a lot of folks who have hired interns, and frankly, the experience of the intern is not that positive. They've been given work to do that nobody else wanted to do, as opposed to work to do that can develop themselves professionally. So pay attention to that. Talented interns can turn into fabulous FTEs. I was an intern in the governor's office in a former life, and at the end of my internship, I was offered a full-time job. So remember, interns are really valuable assets. So a question here on team conflict, and this is a topic dear to my heart. I was the first CEO at NeighborWorks America, and prior to creating the CEO position, there have been two deputies, one who was in charge of the headquarters office in Washington, and one who was in charge of field operations, which was 10 offices across the country. I realize that many of your organizations are far smaller than that. However, I think the things I'm going to share here apply in a variety of situations. There were about 90 staff at headquarters and about 150 in the field. And I was one of the deputies, and I was asked to take the COO job. The idea was that one officer overseeing the entire operation could ease some of the tensions that had developed with sort of headquarters and field divisions. Of course, when I was appointed, the field staff were delighted. They felt like their nightmares were over. The Washington staff were horrified. They felt like life as they knew it was over. So I obviously had some serious work to do. So I needed a plan. And, you know, a plan when there's conflict always starts with talking to people. Talking to people individually. I made a commitment in the first 6 months to talk to every single one of the 90 staff in the Washington office. I mean, it wasn't lengthy conversations. I shared some questions I had for them, and I asked them to think of some questions for me. And I met with every single one of them. I did the same thing in the field offices. I flew around the country for 6 months to all of our field offices, asking the same questions. What do you want to know? And here's what I'd like to hear from you. So talking to people and accumulating the wisdom and the different perspectives and the different positions and the different interests of everybody gives you tremendously valuable information when there's a conflict going on. I established a small committee of both field and headquarters staff. And just a comment on establishing committees. A lot of committees get established based on functional roles. What's people's skill? What's their position in the organization? You know, I would submit that in my view, sort of psychological synergy is just as important as functional roles when you're establishing a committee and you want people to work effectively together. I wanted a team that had a combination of people who had a results focus, people who had a relationship focus, people who were rule followers, people who felt process and rules were important, people who were innovative thinkers, and people who were pragmatic. And more than one of those can exist in one person. So I ended up with a small team of 7, worked very effectively in bringing together the perspectives, the positions, the interests of both the field and headquarters, and worked together effectively as a group because there was a mix of perspectives, not just a mix of functional skill and position. You know, and some of the ground rules we set are great ground rules for any committee you establish. First of all, people agreed to respect each other. People agreed to use I words instead of you and we. People tend in committees to try to believe that they're speaking for a group. We want people to speak for themselves, not for anyone else. Speak from a basis of knowledge, not assumptions. If you don't have evidence that something is true, that is an assumption. You know, getting people to focus on the problem, not on the personalities, is also really, really helpful. I mean, teams can be really important and really helpful, particularly if your organization rewards effective teams. A lot of organizations reward individual contributors, but they don't necessarily recognize or reward teamwork. If you recognize and reward teamwork, the motivation to become part of a team and becoming a part of an effective team is increased substantially. So just paying attention to that. At one point in time, the executive director of my organization rewarded individual contributions, did not recognize teamwork. People then began to silo themselves, you know, that they felt like they could get recognition if within their little department they could produce good results, as opposed to working cross-functionally across departments. So what you do as a leader, what you do as an HR manager can be extremely important in terms of developing teams. So there are a number of questions about the sort of combined into a category of annual reviews, salary increases, and updating job descriptions. I talked about 360 reviews. It's not something I do every year, except if you've hired a key manager in the past year and you don't have a sort of a perch on their effectiveness. It's something you might consider. A huge challenge when I became responsible for human resources was that work plans were crafted in terms of activities and not in terms of results or outcomes. We had a very significant training function in the organization, and the training staff were essentially evaluated based on how many people they had brought into training sessions, sort of affectionately called butts and seats, rather than results, rather than what changed in anyone's performance based on the training that was presented. You know, the field staff, they sort of, they in their self-evaluations talked about how many organizations they had provided technical assistance to in the last year, rather than, you know, what was the impact of the technical assistance in terms of solving a problem or benefiting staff, and what was the evidence. And typically the evidence we were looking for is some testimony or validation by the executive director of that organization that the intervention or the technical assistance had been particularly valuable. Shifting from activities to outcomes in terms of staff performance is a challenge. And it was met with some resistance, not because people didn't like the idea, but because people thought the idea didn't apply to them. My job can't be defined in terms of outcomes. I heard that so many times. And in fact, in most cases, it could be defined in terms of outcomes. And, you know, and I would say to people, if we can't talk about our outcomes, why would anyone pay us to do it? So eventually, gradually, people did begin first to understand the difference between an activity and an outcome or a result, and ultimately an impact. And our organizational plan began to focus more on outcomes and results, which made other people's job descriptions sort of a drop-down menu from that organizational plan. It took hold eventually, and it ultimately worked. But it took time and a lot of repetition. And I remember saying to a consultant I was working with at the time, I've said this so many times, and I've explained it so many times. Why do I really need to say it again? He said, yes, you do. You need to say it until people really, really grasp it, understand it, and value it in terms of their own operations, which was very good advice. In terms of salary increases, this is always a tough one. You know, many organizations distinguish the cost of living increase from merit increases. And some also have bonus awards, and they use bonuses which are not added to a person's salary as a way to moderate salary escalation. Beyond that general framework, it's all over the map, in my experience. Finding comparable salaries in organizations similar to yours can be really helpful. 990 forms can tell you something about senior staff salaries. And the fact is, most organizations have some kind of staff philosophy. Either everyone should get a cost of living increase unless you plan to fire them, or anyone who's not performing up to standard should receive no increase whatsoever. Some organizations tie salary increases to measurable outcomes. numeric ratings on job performances or key performance indicators. The challenge is that some managers are tougher markers than others, and that can become inequitable. It's just critical that you consider equity from all of its angles, both from a employment law standpoint and from the point of view of your staff. There needs to be a perception of equity. People can be unhappy that they're not promoted to a particular position, but they understand what the requirements of the position are, what the compensation involved is, and they can understand it. They may not agree with it, they can understand it. But equity and salary administration is extremely important in an organization, and particularly in a smaller organization. I made the huge mistake at one point of giving, we had people all over the map in terms of how they were administering salaries. And so ultimately I took the salary pool, what we could afford for total salary increase for the entire organization. And I gave individual managers a pool of money relating to the number of staff that they had, et cetera, et cetera. So it was fair across the management team, thinking that that would provide incentive for people to reward merit when everybody knew what the pool was going to be, et cetera. It's not what happened. It's not what happened. I mean, it was a well-conceived idea. And, you know, some managers said our administrative staff are grossly underpaid, so they gave it all to their administrative staff person. I mean, I have had a lot of bright ideas that have not worked. That was fairly close to the top of the list. And I just remember thinking, oh no, we need a new approach. But the concept of equity and paying attention to equity, overlooking the entire salary structure in the organization and believing and being able to defend the fact that it is equitable to everybody involved, even if they may not agree that that is the case, is really important. Position descriptions, I think the question was who should draft them or how should they be drafted? I mean, I would say first and foremost, be sure they are honest, that they are honest reflection of what the requirements of the job are, requirements and expectations. When I was doing executive search work, in order to prepare a job description for a new incoming executive director, I would interview the incumbent if he or she was still present, and or any other people whose perspective and input was relevant. And then I would draw up a job description. And when I presented the position description to the board, I cannot tell you how many board members said, oh no, we can't say that. We can't, that's going to scare people off. And I spent an awful lot of time convincing the board that, yes, you do want to say that. You absolutely do want to say that. Don't say there's no travel if there's a lot of travel. Don't claim the organization is in exceptional financial position if there's work that the new executive director is going to need to do in the early stages to build additional financial support. Don't say the organization has a stellar history if you have a pending lawsuit, employment lawsuit. I mean, tell the truth, be honest. You can still get great candidates. I can't tell you how many executive directors who interviewed for the positions that I wrote position descriptions for said that they were so grateful for an honest description of the position. It's not fair for an executive director to have big surprises. I mean, they're going to have surprises no matter how good a job you do with a job description, but it's not fair for them to have big surprises that should have been consulted, should have been revealed, before they took the job. You can provide a format for job descriptions within your organization. Give people sort of a template that says describe primary roles and functions. What are your reporting relationships? Who you need to work with closely. Most challenging aspects of the position from your perspective. The most rewarding aspects of the position from your perspective. And ask current incumbents to fill out that template for your review, obviously for your review. But it can be really revealing. It can tell you things that you did not know about the job, and it also can tell you if there are people that they need to work with closely, and there are some conflicts that have developed. It also gives you some important cues. So the last question I was going to tackle is about remote onboarding. Again, this is something that onboarding is such a critical role in an organization. Just because somebody has signed a piece of paper and said that they'll take the job does not mean that they're going to stay forever. It doesn't mean that they're going to be happy in the job. It doesn't mean their entry is going to be a simple one. I mean, the fact of the matter is, everybody joining an organization, the two things they want is to learn the job as quickly as they can and do the job as well as they can. So keeping those two things in mind, think about how you're onboarding folks. And virtual onboarding, remote onboarding is very different from what it used to be, but it can be done successfully. Being sure they have the appropriate connectivity. Do they have the software for the role they're assuming? Not everything possible, but for the role they're assuming. I mean, do you use Slack? Do you use Basecamp? What are the ways for employees to talk and communicate with each other? Getting all paperwork done in advance, so this isn't something that you're having to negotiate in the early days of their employment. Putting together an onboarding package, online onboarding package, or physical one if that has more attraction to you. Key policies, some swag if you have it, employee handbook if you have it, key policies. And just a word here, someone the other day said that there's a useful open source employee handbook, and I'll put the address online before the end of the meeting. Host a virtual meet and greet. If it's board members, staff like to meet board members every now and then. Staff don't get any exposure to board members. They hear you talk about the board members, in glowing terms or not so glowing terms, but they don't know who they are. Find ways for staff to at least know who the board members are and what they look like. Host a virtual meet and greet and include the board, and do an introductory memo to all staff, which can be extremely helpful, and people will pick up and follow up and touch base with new staff in some very nice ways if they have the opportunity to know who they are and where they're coming from. So I don't think I'm gonna say I guess I will say one more word about conflict, and this includes conflict on teams, includes conflict within staff. The first obvious lesson is don't ignore it. You need to be proactive. When there is conflict, it rarely goes away by itself. And proactive intervention can make whatever the resolution is much more seamless than if you wait and see what happens. So ask yourself the questions. Does it have to do with the goals people have or the roles they play? Is there a skill gap someplace? Is somebody feeling that another person does not have the skills to do the job? Is that fact or is that fiction? Is that true or not? This is investigation that you can do. Are people's status threatened? Do people feel that somehow working with someone else, that there is a threat to their status in their role, that someone else is assuming some parts of their job that they don't feel is legitimate? And then the issue of positions versus interests is a really important strategy. And some of you, I'm sure, who have taken negotiation courses know about the difference. People have various interests, for their own safety, for their own status, whatever. And then they stake out a position. And positions are very hard to budge unless you can get to the underlying interests. And very often, at least in my experience, when I really get to the underlying interests that two staff who are in conflict with each other are having, their interests aren't that different. Their positions are very different. The degree to which they blame the other is very different and very often misplaced. So understanding people's interests and then understanding how their interests relate to the position that they've taken can be really helpful. And then obviously focusing on the problem, not on the personalities, is essential. I don't think I think somebody asked a question about Gen Z. And to me, Gen Z, these are people in their early 20s. They're people who were born at the turn of the century. It is, in fact, the largest cohort in the country's history. I cannot remember what the numbers are, but this is the first generation that is really they're really digital natives. In other words, they didn't migrate from analog to digital. They are digital natives. And some of this, oh, great. Somebody's putting items in the chat, so pay attention to the chat. The internet is part of their DNA, and there are consequences of that. And one of the consequences that employers have noted is that they are so screen focused that they neglect personal relationships or collegial relationships on their teams. And that can be a valuable piece of information in order to design some strategies to build collegial relationships. You know, other things that are said, I mean, the great things that are said is that they are passionate about social change. They're passionate about climate. They're passionate about seeing real change in the world as they know it. But according to a Gallup poll in 2022, they are also the most disengaged people at work. And they report more overall stress and burnout than other cohorts, which is really interesting. So these are people, you know, born at the turn of the century, the centennial generation. It's just an interesting, I do not work at this point with the centennial generation. So I'm not sure that I can personally offer any great advice, but there is a lot of information, online information about who this generation is and strategies for engaging them more deeply and getting them to learn some patience in the workplace. So I will only add a couple of things and then I will open it for other questions. And my thing that I was planning to offer is great ideas that were thwarted, great ideas I had that were thwarted by staff who were much smarter than I was. And some of you have probably tried this. People were complaining that their email was, they were overwhelmed by email. So I made the brilliant decision to say there will be no more email on Fridays unless there is an emergency. I can almost hear you saying, I know what happened. People had 7,000 emails in their inbox on Monday. So that was foolish. It made sense at the time. It made sense until the following Monday. Another mistake I've made is when you're supervising a number of people and you have a deadline, and not everybody meets the deadline. My practice was to send an email reminder out to everyone, just saying, remember the deadline was last Friday for this particular input. And at some point, Beth Prentice, who was one of the smartest staff I ever worked with, said to me, you know, if 8 of us have met the deadline and 2 of us haven't, send the email to the 2. Don't send it to all of us. And her point was, you know, simply, I was trying to avoid embarrassing anybody, but her point was, we met the deadline. We haven't fallen short here. So those were 2 of the most valuable small lessons that I learned when I thought I had a bright idea. So let me just ask if there's anybody who has a particular question. We've got, you know, 5 minutes here. Is there any particular question that anybody can raise their hand if they have a question? And if I don't see it, maybe Dora will see it.
I'm not seeing anything
Okay.
yet. Jacqueline did ask about the open source resource for the employee handbook.
Right.
I can send it out later. I'll be sending it.
No, yeah, okay, we'll send it out after the session. I have it here, but
okay. We have a question from the Mill City Growth staff.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Great. I loved when you were talking about the difference between personnel and HR, and that part of that was staff recognition. Do you have any examples of recognition programs that you've done that have been well received by staff that you've worked with?
It's a really, really good question, because there have been some staff recognitions programs that have not been well received. I mean, an awful lot of organizations use peer nominations as an approach to, and if the right question is asked when people are asked to make a nomination, I think it can be really powerful, you know. So, you know, sometimes it is a just-in-time thing. People are asked that over the course of the year, if something occurs where somebody has done something particularly exceptional, unusual, that's likely to be unnoticed by others, call it out. And that becomes, you know, the cause for staff recognition. And recognition by their peers is really important, as is recognition, obviously, by the folks who they report to, et cetera. But I don't know, I guess I'd throw the question back at you or everybody here. Has anybody here found a recognition program that you feel like is just exactly on the mark? I'm not seeing.
We've done, I think the term you used was like just in time. We had integrated it as part of our regular staff meetings. So when we were all sitting together or virtually together, we could, you know, just share something about one of our peers. And I think that was the last thing we did at our staff meeting every month. And it left people with like a good feeling, like they had been seen and recognized.
And let me ask you this, when you did that, did you ask everybody to recognize the same person, or did you ask people to recognize everybody? I mean, how did you make it not feel just totally generic?
I don't think that it ever did feel totally generic, but it was completely popcorn style, and it was whoever you wanted to call out at that point in time. So it might be, you know, a particular team that had done something that was very supportive for you or your team, or it could be an individual recognizing them for some hard work that they did or something that they had achieved. And it was all very, I mean, it was just verbal.
I think that's great. And in some respects, I really feel like peer recognition is even more important sometimes, because CEOs and people in senior management, including when I was in senior management, I don't always see the small things that people do that they deserve recognition for. I mean, I expect that their managers will, but I don't always see it. And so recognition from me could very easily feel inequitable to a whole bunch of people that I don't mean to offend. So I think peer recognition it's great that you do that. Great.
Thank you.
Okay, anything else? Okay, I will definitely share the 360 feedback. We'll send that out too. Is there anything else, any particular topic that people would particularly like to see an article on? I mean, I have an extensive electronic library, and I'm happy to send out anything. And as I said, I'm also happy to schedule a call with people, but is there any topic in particular that is pressing for anybody at the moment? Okay. Okay, well, we will send out the two things we said we would. And again, you, let me just going to put my work email in the chat. So anybody who wants to set up a call, I'm very happy to do that. Just send me an email and we're good for 2 o'clock. And I will promise, who's Bob Burbridge, I promise you I'll read this and just get back to you, Bob. I didn't have a chance to read all of it.
Well,
Did you
Margo,
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you type in your, which email address did you
I'm
want
using my work
to-
one. Actually, I did.
Oh, you did? Because I don't see it.
Look again. No?
Oh, there it is. Yep, I do see it. Yep. Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure if I see it, then everybody else can see it. And I just
and-
want to let other people know that on the Nonprofit Net website, in our sort of news section, there's a management insight where a lot is from Margo, articles and recommendations that she has shared with the community. So feel free to go to our nonprofitnet.org website for that information.
And I'd like to suggest also including Margo's address with the follow-up email with some of the other information you're sending out. So thank you, Margo. You know, I was thinking about during your presentation, you can have a printed manual, a how-to, but so many examples from your personal experience are so valuable. And I don't know, you know, how else someone could get that kind of information. So thank you so much for sharing it. And I think it really made an impact for a number of people. So looking ahead, Nonprofit Net's free Zoominar series is going to continue in September. Please watch your email, social media, and our website for details on next season's series of practical and expert-led Zoominars. This is NPN's 20th anniversary year, so we're suggesting a $20 donation to support our work and keep the Zoominars coming your way. We'll send you a donation link as well as a satisfaction survey link. So have a great summer, and we'll see you in September. Bye for now.
Thank you.